We are continuing this week with part 2 of Rule 5 of Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos. If you forgot, dear viewer, what this rule was, it is, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. As is customary, allow me to dispense with nuance and share with you the book's messages. As in the first part for this rule, Peterson is still the best parent. Second, you can use the Peterson version of operant conditioning to get your kids to do what you want them to, but only to a certain point. After that, 3, you need to discipline your children, although it isn't defined, so exactly what is meant by discipline is left up to the reader's discretion. Welcome back. So, we're continuing on with the Peterson fun train and how to raise your kids. So, I was a bit naive a week ago, 2 weeks ago, thinking I could get through this chapter in just 2 videos. Who'd have figured that taking on a topic like child rearing would require time and care and clarity, especially when something like 2/3 of the adults in the US think that physical discipline is still the way to go with your child. This is me saying there's going to be a part 3. You like it thorough, right? As with the previous Peterson videos, the visual cues differentiating the different trains of thought for this video are Peterson video. This setup is me and my response. Finally, Lab Goggle Pikachu is for reference, discussion, or other sciencey stuff that comes up. Also, I use the book's section names as the things to break up the video, so that's where those weird things are coming from. Finally, if you like the cut of my jib, consider supporting the channel over on Patreon. Share with your friends or your enemies. I'll take them. Like, comment, subscribe, especially subscribe. Delicious, delicious subs. Alright, anyways, video. Part 2 of parenting. The parenting inning. Dun dun dun. There's a GIF that periodically makes the rounds on Reddit, and I apologize for the quality that I was able to find. But in this GIF, a woman takes her flip-flop off in order to get her kid to come out from the display in a Lowe's. The woman is telling the kid to get out of there or else he gets the shoe, and that he has experienced the shoe in the past. Invariably, when this gets posted, there's this pattern of responses. First are the reminiscent commiserations over la chancla or other cultural equivalents. La chancla being a legendary force of Latino or Latina discipline. Then there's the counter posts that argue that physical discipline isn't the best form of discipline. Without fail, there will be counter posts of people who experienced this form of discipline as a child and they turned out fine. Counter, just because that's the way your parents did it and you turned out fine doesn't mean that's the best way to do it, etc., etc. Sometimes the post gets locked. How to go about disciplining your child is a contentious topic, to say the least. Peterson is on the side of physical discipline being an acceptable part of the toolbox. I'm on team nope, not that. So is the science, but who's counting? So the physical discipline discussion will happen in the next video, so we will be talking about that later. Most of this video will be setting up discipline in general and sort of laying the groundwork for physical discipline being a-okay.
The neglect and mistreatment that is part and parcel of poorly structured or even entirely absent disciplinary approaches can be deliberate, motivated by explicit, conscious, if misguided, parental motives. But more often than not, modern parents are simply paralyzed by the fear that they will no longer be liked or even loved by their children if they chastise them for any reason. They want their children's friendship above all and are willing to sacrifice respect to get it.
Granted, some parents could definitely use the advice that being a parent comes first and being a buddy of the kid comes second, hopefully. I will not deny the existence of overly permissive parents who let their kids get away with practically murder in order to try to be their friend. However, to say that all parents who aren't disciplining their kids in the way that Peterson deems best are doing it out of fear Happen to have a reference or a source for that? No? Just opinion? Cool. Peterson says that a child has 2 parents and many friends, and the friends can't really correct the behaviors. What about Rule 3 and having friends who will correct your bad behavior? Nope. Cool. Fine. But the parents absolutely can, and so they must. It is absolutely on the parents to correct their child's behaviors so they can live in a society in a meaningful way. He continues on for a bit about the importance of disciplining your children and says that parents who don't discipline their kids are either doing it because they're falling for the lie that disciplining their kids will harm their creativity, or the belief that discipline is harmful. Vagueness again. He really ought to have defined what he means by discipline. It's such a loaded term and it can mean so many different things. I'll agree that kids need structure and rules and feedback on what behaviors are okay and what aren't, but all discipline is not created equally. Not all options involve physically harming your child. Although, this is a way to ease into the argument that he will eventually be making about physical discipline without necessarily scaring away the readers who are on the fence about whether or not to do it. Get the reader to agree with the founding points of the argument before escalating into the more contentious part. Peterson says that rules and structure are absolutely necessary for kids because they can't be trusted to make their own decisions. His examples for this are diet and bedtime, and I feel attacked.
Children are perfectly capable of attempting to subsist on hot dogs, chicken fingers, and Fruit Loops if doing so will attract attention, provide power, or shield them from trying anything new. Instead of going to bed wisely and peacefully, children will fight nighttime unconsciousness until they are staggered by fatigue.
I was a picky eater. I wouldn't try chicken fingers, tenders, nuggets, whatever, until high school. But the hot dog thing is dead on. Although, not straightforward. I had many phases. So first, I wouldn't eat the hot dog's bun, just the hot dog. But then, the hot dog had to be raw, it couldn't be cooked. And then it flipped so that I would only eat the bun and like the ketchup and pickles and whatever, and not the hot dog. And just, my husband hears about this stuff and just laughs. Like, how did my parents not kill me? But I didn't do these things for attention or a dominance, power struggle, or any of that. It was a texture thing or a flavor thing. There was a period where I would not eat hamburg meat at all because of the weird little oily texture it can leave in your mouth sometimes. I am also one of the 10% of the population who is a super taster. The relevant part of it for this is that vegetables, depending on how they're prepared, can be gross. So, Brussels sprouts is an example. When they're prepared well, they taste like grass to me. Not the best. When they're prepared poorly, they taste like soap, and I can't eat them. And Mom, I love you. Thank you for feeding me and all of that. But there's a reason I ate everything smothered in ketchup pretty much until I moved out and then immediately kicked that habit. Sorry. Sleep-wise, I am and have always been a night owl. I already shared in part 1 episodes of my reading hijinks at bedtime, so I won't repeat that here. But going to bed at 8 meant I was going to be laying in bed for a couple hours just waiting to fall asleep. There was no fighting unconsciousness. I would lay there and just be bored out of my mind. So I read. But it's always got to be about attention seeking or power dynamics with Peterson. You can't have your little lobster getting dominant over you. Peterson continues that kids will provoke adults in order to figure out boundaries. Yep. Easiest way to figure out what is or isn't allowed is to figure out where the boundaries are. Test those conditions. Just kids lack the subtlety and the ability to communicate about this. He shares a story of a boy messing with his daughter when she was a little girl at the playground and having a revenge fantasy of chucking the boy 30 feet down the field. There was a part in Rule 4, the don't compare yourself to other people thing, that revenge fantasies were indicative of resentment.
Don't use my logic against me.
Imagine a toddler repeatedly striking his mother in the face. Why would he do such a thing? It's a stupid question. It's unacceptably naive. The answer is obvious. To dominate his mother. To see if he can get away with it. Violence, after all, is no mystery. It's peace that's the mystery. Violence is the default.
Have you seen infants and toddlers? They're just flailing half the time. They're not super coordinated. And yeah, sometimes you get a rather punchy child, but I hardly say them hitting their mom in the face is a huge power move. And we're back to Peterson being condescending. Neat. Then he sounds a bit psychopathic, talking about how if he can overpower you, he can do whatever he wants to you, and that this behavior is natural. Peterson says that kids statistically are people at their most violent stage, and his evidence for this is a paper by himself from 2005. This feels like the statistic that most dog attacks come from things like chihuahuas. Children need to be corrected that physical actions are not the way to solve problems, and at this point he still hasn't defined what correction means. Kind of ironic, Peterson saying that kids need to be taught that physical actions are not the way to solve problems, and will later say to do it with physical actions. He shares a story of his son at around 9 months of age and the drama that they had feeding him. So Peterson says that at 9 months old, his son decided to start feeding himself, and they were all for it. And the problem was, he would start to eat a couple bites, and then 9-month-old play with the food, and it would go everywhere except his mouth.
He would drop bits of it over the high chair tabletop and watch as it fell on the floor below.
My first reaction to this was, sounds like you got yourself a cat, not a kid. But if you don't have your developmental milestones memorized, it's not really normal to expect kids to feed themselves until around 2. And even at 2, so that's 24 months, not 9 months, it's good to encourage them to play with the food, get the spoon going, get food in their mouth, build autonomy. It's good to encourage that, but not to expect them to be able to feed themselves entirely well past 2, maybe 3 or 4. Also, parents should expect a mess for 2 main reasons. First, kids aren't really coordinated that well at that age, so yeah, they're gonna get some in their mouth, but most of it's probably gonna be elsewhere. Second, there's probably gonna just be playtime with the food at some point. The kid's gonna eat for a little bit, and then, yay, Play-Doh, gravity, just kids. But I guess the Petersons weren't feeding him beyond what he was getting in himself, and Dr. P describes that because the baby wasn't eating enough, he wasn't sleeping, and because he wasn't sleeping, it was waking up the parents, and that his son was
frustrating his mother, and she was taking it out on me. The trajectory wasn't good.
The phrasing on this makes it sound like Peterson only really had a problem with the situation because his wife was getting up his ass about stuff. Also, you shouldn't really be relying on your kid to be able to feed themselves adequately until you know that they can feed themselves adequately. Duh. After several days of this, Peterson had to dominate his lobster baby.
I decided to take the spoon back. I prepared for war. I set aside sufficient time. A patient adult can defeat a 2-year-old, hard as that is to believe. I assured myself of victory. He was stubborn and horrible, but I could be worse. We sat down, face to face, bowl in front of him. It was high noon. He knew it, and I knew it. He picked up the spoon, I took it from him, and spooned up a delicious mouthful of mush.
Remember just a little bit ago, the whole letting your kid play with eating, but not necessarily relying on them being able to feed themselves entirely? This alpha male display is not that. This is taking away something the kid wants to try doing in order to assert your dominance over the kid. No wonder this boy was dressing himself by 3 if this was the type of shit he had to put up with. Standing in for baby Peterson is the lobster, because of course. So, he sits down to have this time with his son and feed him because enough is enough. So he goes in with the food, kid starts doing the dodgy head thing. He was prepared for this. He starts poking him in the chest. And eventually baby P has had enough of this, opens his mouth in protest, In goes the food. Baby Peterson has a trick up his sleeve, tries to spit the food back out. Daddy P was prepared for this and puts a finger over his mouth so that the food can't really come out, at least not well. And some of the food gets swallowed. Peterson is quite happy with this and takes it as progress, so gives him a pat on the head. I can only hope he used the same hand that he did the finger thing with, so it was covered in baby food and like wiped it a little bit. That would just be peak comedy. Okay, so this process goes on, and an hour later, the baby is fed.
My wife had to leave the room. The stress was too much, but food was eaten by the child. My son collapsed, exhausted on my chest. We had a nap together, and he liked me a lot better when he woke up than he had before he was disciplined.
Maybe Baby P's opinion on Daddy P hadn't changed. Maybe it was just that Baby P had finally eaten enough and so now was able to chill. As further evidence that Peterson is the best parent, he describes a time that he watched a 2-year-old for another couple. And no, Peterson wasn't running some weird daycare operation out of his home as a professor. That would be weird. So this was one of those friend adult things that you do where one couple watches other people's kids so that they can go have a nice night out, and then another night that couple will watch your kids so you can have a nice night out. You know, it's like the ride sharing but with kid watching. I don't know. So this kid's being dropped off at the Petersons, and they're told that the kid doesn't honor nighttime conventions and will be tucked in, but then will get up and go downstairs and watch Elmo. Trivia, not at all meant to be weaponized at any point in the future, ever. Peterson hates Elmo.
I always hated that creepy whiny puppet. He was a disgrace to Jim Henson's legacy.
What follows is the description of a life and death dominance struggle between Peterson and this 2-year-old. So the 2-year-old was put in a crib, so he would have a harder time escaping to watch Elmo, which the Petersons were not going to have. And so the kid counters by crying so loud that he's threatening to wake up the other kids. Peterson counters this by going in and telling him to lie down or I will lay you down. Kid counters by crying some more. I should note that the tone used in this lie down or I will lay you down isn't included. There is a bit of a difference between lie down and lie down. Peterson then diverts a little bit to talk about kids crying is usually because a child is angry, not because of sadness or pain, with a reference. Before getting into the reference itself, long-suffering adjunct needs to complain a little bit. Peterson made hunting down this reference a little bit more difficult because he accidentally'd an author and also the title a little. So, thanks. The point of this paper was to provide practitioners with basic information to help them and the parents they serve better become able to recognize the expressive signals of the infants and young children in their care. The authors describe this skill in being able to read children as coming naturally to some, but it being more difficult in general if the child has some form of developmental disability. The authors also say that this is important for practitioners to work on because you can get a sense of how the child is doing just normally, and also maybe get hints if things aren't going smoothly neurologically. The authors reviewed a couple different coding systems for determining a child's facial expression. Said another way, these are just standardized ways to figure out what face the kid's making. And they're also going to cover the different faces that kids make and what different displays are associated with that normally or in not normal development. The expressions that they include are interest, surprise, enjoyment, physical pain, disgust, the angry or cry face, the sad pout face, and fear. In the anger or cry face expression, the authors say that this expression is the infant's most common negative expression. This is followed by a discussion of how the anger or cry face expression is typically not seen in isolation. Usually, it's in combination with something else, resulting in a blended expression. For example, you might have a kid doing the angry cry face up top, with a pout or sad face on the bottom, so something like is fairly common. Briefly, there is a lot of discussion about this particular expression, the anger cry face, and it mixing with a lot of other negative expressions, maybe meaning that the kid isn't necessarily angry all the time this face is showing up, but is just indicating that the kid is unhappy. Maybe they're sad, maybe they're uncomfortable, maybe they are legitimately angry. Also, it's possible that this face is reflecting the central nervous system's known strong response to negative stuff early in life. As the infant matures some, the anger cry face stabilizes so that it reflects the child learning basically cause and effect. Kid does an action and something happens. So this face gets busted out when the kid is blocked from doing what they want to do. So yes to this face showing up when a kid is crying, not so much to guaranteeing that this is the kid being angry about something or really having anything to do with dominance. Back to Peterson.
Anger crying is often an act of dominance and should be dealt with as such.
And you might have thought I was joking around when I said that Peterson takes these as dominance fights. The previously discussed article says nothing about dominance. Surprise. Okay, so from the article, the verbal anger crying comes about when making the face, when the kid doesn't get to have their way, wasn't enough to convince the world to give in. Little Billy's anger crying because he wants to play for another hour on the playground and his parents are saying no. How do you diffuse the situation? One method is not to give in to what they want, remove them from whatever situation they're in, give them time and space to calm down. This can function as a timeout. And when they're calm, praise them for calming down. That is a good thing. And have a talk with them. Let them talk about what led to the escalation. What feelings were they having? Maybe they were frustrated. Maybe they were angry. Let them voice that. Have a dialogue. Let them understand that, we have other things we need to do. We don't have the money for this, whatever. Engage the child in the discussion. Related to this is to give warnings when things are going to happen. Like in the park situation. Hey, Billy, we're going to be leaving in 10 or 15 minutes. Get your last playing in because we're going to go after. And stick to that. The child needs to know that they can rely on your word. The Peterson method, as demonstrated by the wrapping up Elmo story, is for the parent to assert their will and dominance over the child. And you can use such statements as lie down, monster. And when that fails to do the job, point at the kid and down, monster. So yeah, Elmo fan went to sleep. The kid's parents were shocked by Peterson's parenting prowess, but didn't ask him for his secret, nor did he share it. Apparently you have to pay for that knowledge. Peterson says that modern parents are terrified of punishment and discipline, but re-emphasizes the importance of their use. And then there's a statement leading into the discussion on operant conditioning that I find a little bit baffling.
It's not that it's impossible to discipline with reward. In fact, rewarding good behavior can be very effective.
I think the point he's trying to convey with that is...
Editor's note. I think I finally understand the quote. He's not talking about discipline as punishment, but discipline as reinforcement, reward, and punishment. So, okay.
Operant conditioning 101. Let's start by talking about learning. Learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior as a result of experience. That experience part is important because if a behavior just shows up out of the blue without any sort of feedback, we can't say that that behavior is learned. So instincts show up out of the blue with no real learning happening there. And we know learning has occurred by observing this change in behavior after the feedback. Some cute pet examples. A dog gets particularly excited whenever you go near where its leash is stored. This dog has learned the association between that area of the house, you getting the leash on it, and it going for walkies, and getting very excited about that. It can also happen in cats. So let's say you have a cat that you feed canned cat food. It, over time, learns to associate the can opener with food. So whenever you use a can opener, even if it's not for cat food, the cat's there wanting to be fed. An important part here is that these responses that the animals are doing to the leash or the can opener or whatever aren't natural responses. Dogs, prior to learning that the leashes mean walkies, don't care about leashes. Cats, prior to learning that can opener equals food, don't care about can openers. These are conditioned responses that are acquired through learning. For completeness and context, we can talk about two main classes of learning. There's observational learning and associative learning. Observational learning, we won't be talking about today beyond this, but it's basically what it sounds like. You learn by watching others. Associative learning is basically learning two things go together. So this includes classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning, we won't be talking about today, but if you're familiar with Pavlov, it's that. Operant conditioning is largely the product of B.F. Skinner, who was a behavioral psychologist. As a side note, my field, cognitive psychology, was formed kind of as a response to behaviorism, but that's a topic for another day. Operant conditioning is learning in which a behavior is changed as a result of the consequence. Basically, behaviors can be changed as a result of either reinforcement or punishment. And so a way to think about this type of learning is that the behavior operates on the environment to produce a result. Skinner's work was almost entirely with animal models, so typically rats or pigeons. This is a Skinner box which the animal would be put into, and it would have some sort of species-appropriate way to indicate a response. So for rats, this was a little lever for them to push, and for pigeons, it was something for them to peck at. They do the response, and depending on the conditions of stuff, they would get a reward, food. And also, these boxes critically have something to record when these responses are happening. Basically, you would have like a timestamp of when the lever was pushed. Alright, so the reason we're talking about operant conditioning is because of reward or reinforcement and punishment. And so the critical thing to keep in mind here is that reinforcing a behavior increases the likelihood of it happening again, and punishing a behavior decreases the likelihood of that behavior happening again. We can also talk about positive and negative forms of both, and this is where intro-psych students almost invariably get confused. Let's go through the 4 possible combinations of positive, negative, punishment, reinforcement, and this will come back to parenting, I promise. Reinforcement, reward. Remember that this increases the likelihood of behavior. So positive reinforcement is adding a goodie. This is adding a desirable stimulus, if you will, when the desired behavior happens. So an example of this would be getting good grades and being taken out for ice cream. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus. Said another way, you're removing a baddie. So an example of this that probably everybody experienced at some point in their childhood was the nagging parent. You need to clean your room, take out the trash, do the dishes, whatever. And until you do that behavior, nag, 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 nag. When are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? Are you going to do it yet? Why aren't you doing it? Nag, 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 nag. You do the behavior, and the aversive stimulus stops. All right, on to punishment, which remember is done to decrease the frequency of a target behavior. Positive punishment, as oxymoronic as that sounds, is the addition of an aversive stimulus. You're adding a baddie. And this will be the bulk of what we'll talk about for Peterson's parenting advice, mostly in the next video. Basically, the physical discipline. And to round out the table, we have negative punishment, where you are removing a desirable stimulus. So this is taking away a goodie. You get grounded, time out, whatever. These are negative punishments because you're removing the freedom to do whatever you want to do. The important thing to remember about punishment is that it only really tells the organism being punished, don't do this behavior. It doesn't tell the organism what behavior to do instead of that. The other big thing that Peterson talks about related to all of this is shaping. Shaping is a procedure where you slowly guide behavior using reinforcers, using incremental steps, to whatever the target action is. Said another way, you're rewarding behaviors that are kind of approximations of what the desired end goal is, and gradually you work your way to that full behavior. An example of shaping would be Jenna Marbles trying to get Marbles to sit. And so in the video, you watch her try to wait for Marbles putting his butt down a little bit and rewarding that behavior, but she ends up helping, kind of getting him to sit and like, oh, good, you're sitting, good, here's a treat, good reward. And then eventually he figures it out and kind of tries to do it. It's a little hard for the little guy. Life in the Skinner box would be kind of similar. Early on, kinda. Scaled back. So you've got a naive rat who doesn't know what's up. You put it in the Skinner box and you wait. The rat eventually gets comfortable with its environment enough to look around because they are curious. So it will typically hang around the outside of the cage, and as it's doing this, it's smelling things, it's raising up and leaning on the wall and doing all this stuff. Eventually, hopefully, it'll come to the part of the cage where the lever is. It might step on the lever on the way up to the wall, or it might slip down and push the lever. Either way, push the lever, food pops out. What's this? I like food. Food's cool. So the rat will try to figure out how it got food, and it'll try to replicate what it was doing in order to get more food. And so it figures out eventually that lever equals food, and now you have a trained rat. Alright, so that should be enough to get us through the rest of this chapter. If you guys are curious about this, I am more than happy to talk about learning. Just let me know, and that can be added to the to-do list. Peterson talks about Skinner, operant conditioning, the research that Skinner did, and then an example of shaping with kids. But then Peterson says that with the shortcomings of operant conditioning and shaping, such as needing to be able to swoop in right when the desired behavior happens and reinforce it, or needing to have sufficiently motivated learners, means that this isn't really the way to go. Peterson argues that both positive and negative emotions are useful in helping us learn, but that the negative emotions are more potent in doing so.
We therefore do our children a disservice by failing to use whatever is available to help them learn, including negative emotions, even though such use should occur in the most merciful possible manner.
The negative emotions meaning pain, fear, shame, disgust, and anxiety. Weaponized anxiety should not be a disciplinary tactic, for fuck's sake. That shit leaves wounds. Skinner is brought up again in the context of that 2x2 grid that we talked about earlier, specifically punishment reducing unwanted behaviors. Yeah, punishment works, but you get more bang for your buck out of reinforcement and happier customers all around. As I said in the operant conditioning part, punishment only really indicates what behaviors not to do. And what's helpful is knowing what behaviors to do. And reinforcement lets the organism know, do this thing. Because you couldn't fill out your Peterson bingo card if we didn't go someplace weird, he brings up the Disney version of Sleeping Beauty. Much symbolism, very deep, blah blah blah. The point.
Something existentially similar to Sleeping Beauty's story occurs very frequently with overprotected children, who can be brought low, and then desire the bliss of unconsciousness by their first real contact with failure, or worse, genuine malevolence, which they do not or will not understand and against which they have no defense.
So the parent should be malevolent to prepare the child instead? Peterson's applied example here is of a little girl who hasn't learned how to share. So this little girl hasn't learned to share properly because her parents are too nice to correct her when she's not sharing. Because she doesn't share, the other kids her age won't be friends with her because she can't cooperate and be nice. The other parents won't like her and so won't have her around their kids. And because she is now alone and rejected by everybody, she will end up on that resentment, anxiety, depression spiral to the raisin cookies of chaotic doom. Parents who opt out of disciplining their children are not disciplining their children, still undefined by the way, because they don't want to be the bad guy. But they're ultimately screwing their kids over long term.
The judgmental and uncaring broader social world will mete out conflict and punishment far greater than that which would have been delivered by an awake parent. You can discipline your children, or you can turn that responsibility over to the harsh, uncaring, judgmental world. And the motivation for the latter decision should never be confused with love.
If he was just talking about not physical discipline, I'd have no issue here. But because he's never defined what he means by discipline and what's coming later in the chapter? No.
Squirrel!
Somewhat shifting into a more sympathetic good cop voice.
You might object, as modern parents sometimes do. Why should a child even be subject to the arbitrary dictates of a parent? In fact, there is a new variant of politically correct thinking that presumes that such an idea is adultism, a form of prejudice and oppression analogous to, say, sexism or racism. The question of adult authority must be answered with care. That requires a thorough examination of the question itself. Accepting an objection as formulated is halfway to accepting its validity, and that can be dangerous if the question is ill-formed.
We'll get to that reference and adultism in a sec, but first, let's talk about the second half of that quote. I have spent far too long trying to decipher what exactly is meant by the second half of this quote. I get that if an idea, objection, whatever is bad, accepting it as truth is not good. But to me, if you're accepting an objection, then that means you're accepting it as valid. And maybe I'm being dense here, but I'm not understanding this halfway business. But the important idea here is that Peterson views this adultism as dangerous. So let's talk about it, shall we? This new idea is sourced from a 1978 paper talking about a form of biased behavior that adults can exhibit towards children based solely on the age difference and also power dynamic differences. This paper was actually an interesting and thought-provoking read and was a bit of a change of pace from what cognitive papers are. So this was more in the social and developmental psych, and it was also more of a theory change of policy paper, so that was kind of cool. The author basically detailed problematic or harmful behaviors that adults can do towards kids based solely on that age difference, or even kids can do to other kids. And these include treating kids as inferior both physically and cognitively compared to adults until they hit that magical age of maturity, being overprotective or possessive of children because of the previous point, insisting that a child grow up how the parent or other adult wants, instead of letting the kid be the kid and embracing their uniqueness. Not engaging with kids when they question why things are the way they are, and just insisting that they do it a certain way because you're the parent and you know what's best. Encouraging overly dependent behavior so that the child can't really leave the nest and move on. And finally, insisting that children learn a certain way, and that way is passive and not active, and learning needs to be as stale and bland and boring as possible. A choice part. So constructively helping kids grow, providing feedback, boundaries, rules is good, but it is adultist when they use their extra power to mold a child with whom they come into contact in their own image. Such adults may use their extra power to hide from themselves the fact that they may be too full of their own importance and too self-righteous. Indeed. I'm not seeing the dreaded PC police running amok here. This paper isn't even really calling for one of those huge revolutions that Peterson tends to be so afraid of. This paper is really just trying to say that adults need to be mindful that kids are individuals with their own hopes and dreams and desires and drives and needs and wants and whatever, just like adults. They're people, and we need to respect them as people and honor their dignity. So what is the danger that Peterson sees here? Well, for starters, it seems like he didn't read the paper. It doesn't disagree with him in some parts. Like, it also encourages structure and rules for kids to grow up in a not dysfunctional way, sort of like Peterson. But I feel like he saw the title, he saw ageism in this context, and flipped his shit. But let's not put the cart in front of the horse, and let's hear what he actually has to say. First, a child should be grateful and thankful for the adult's care and guidance and resources, and so they should act like it. Second, the kid needs to be taught how to live in a society.
If a child has not been taught to behave properly by the age of 4, it will forever be difficult for him or her to make friends. The research literature is quite clear on this.
And I'm not being petty or selectively quoting Peterson here to make him look bad. There's not a reference here. The last reference was the Adultism paper, and the next reference is about chimpanzee hierarchies. So, yeah, citation please. Also, the Adultism paper doesn't dispute this. Third, rules aren't always arbitrary. The Adultism paper didn't argue against this either, but okay, go off, I guess.
If a society does not adequately reward productive, pro-social behavior, insists upon distributing resources in a markedly arbitrary and unfair manner, and allows for theft and exploitation, it will not remain conflict-free for long. Distributing resources in a markedly arbitrary and unfair manner.
Does he think we're conflict-free right now? The aforementioned chimp hierarchy is apparently evidence for this idea, establishing that societal collapse is imminent when things suck hard enough is a fundamental biological truth. Finally,
poorly socialized children have terrible lives. Thus, it is better to socialize them optimally. Some of this can be done with reward, but not all of it. This issue is therefore not whether to use punishment and threat. The issue is whether to do it consciously and thoughtfully.
Yes. Justify the not yet defined discipline as for their own good. You must socialize them with maximum efficiency, after all. His reframing here, it's so blunt. Like to him, you're gonna discipline your children. That's a given because his argument has been so compelling so far. The issue is if you're going to discipline your kids in the way he says to, or if you're just gonna smack your kids. There's no debate.
How, then, should children be disciplined?
How then, indeed.